Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast, The Doctor is In series. This is episode 189. I'm Chris Hadnagy, CEO and founder of Social Engineer LLC, the Innocent Lives Foundation, the Institute for Social Engineering, as well as social-engineer.org. And I've been hosting this podcast since 2009. In this particular series, I am joined by my awesome and very intelligent co-host, Dr. Abbie Maroño. Nice to have you here, Abbie.
Nice to be here, Chris. I am Dr. Abbie Maroño. I'm a behavioral scientist, the Director of Education at Social Engineer. I'm a nonverbal communication expert and coach and a lecturer in psychology. And I have a PhD in behavioral analysis and psychology.
And she's also the person who's personally assigned to slap me around every time I say something even a tad bit wrong.
Yes.
And scientifically, Okay, so let's do a quick announcement. Sponsor for this show is our company, Social Engineer. So if you have any needs in the human security space, you should check out our site, social-engineer.com. We focus on adversarial simulations, like with the human side of vectors, like vishing, phishing, smishing, and impersonation. And we do it all based on an empathetic scientific approach to help you guarantee some better security measures inside your company. You can check that out. We also released all of our training for 2023. Well, I shouldn't say all of it. We'll probably add some throughout the year, but we have a number of classes. Our APSE class live, a couple of those going on this year. We have a SERA class, Social Engineering Risk Assessment. That's virtual. You can sign up for that. And our OSINT class with the one and only Ryan McDougall. You can sign up for that too, all on social-engineer.com. So check that out. And if you're interested in social engineering and like the topic and discussing all different aspects of it, you can join our Slack channel. The link is in the show notes down below, or you can ping me on Twitter at HumanHacker or on LinkedIn, and I'll get you the link to it if you don't know where it is, if you can't find it. But we have over, I think it's 1,200 or 1,500 people in there now talking about all aspects of social engineering each and every day. In addition, we have a nice job board where companies come in and they post work that they're looking for in the InfoSec space. And we've had a number of people, I think 8 or 9 now, find new employment because of that job board. So if you're interested, hop on in. It's a family-friendly channel. So if that sounds like you, jump on in and we'd enjoy to have you join us there. I'd like to invite everyone who's listening to take a chance to go check out the Innocent Lives Foundation at innocentlivesfoundation.org. It's a nonprofit organization that myself and Abbie and many others here work with, and we have over 50 volunteers all working on the same mission, which is to help law enforcement uncover people who anonymously traffic children, hurt children, and create child abuse material. In the last 5 years, we've worked on 477 cases so far. So proud of the team over there. We do it all as a nonprofit. So if you want to support us, you can do that through donations at innocentlivesfoundation.org, or you can even volunteer if you have OSINT skills or other skills that can help a nonprofit. Feel free to jump on the website, check out some of our material, and ping us with any questions you may have. And last but not least, you should check out the best rock and roll band, Clutch, pro-rock.com, because they are the intro and outro music for this show. So we love them, and Neil is part of the ILF, and the whole band actually supports ILF. You can see the little donate button on Spotify next to the Clutch record. They have all their proceeds from that donation button go right to the ILF. So we're super happy to be supporting them as they are supporting us. So go check them out. Okay, let's get to our show. So, Abbie, today we're talking about a interesting topic that doesn't have much to do with social engineering. What did you decide we were going to cover today?
We are going to cover natural-born killers or monsters in the making. So it's a true crime-focused podcast today.
But not with an actual one crime that we're following, right?
No, so we want to kind of talk about the origins of evil and violence. We see stories in the news a lot, and we always ask ourselves, how could somebody do this? How could somebody be so evil? But when we focus on these individual stories, for example, Ted Bundy, we get very involved in that case and kind of the science goes away and we celebritize serial killers, and it's morbid, but it happens all the time. So in these kinds of talks or studies, I try and stay away from the specific cases and just focus on the science of evil, I guess.
So that's an interesting question because, sometimes you do see stories like you brought up Ted Bundy, and he was so horrifically evil. I guess the question for a non-scientific person, like just a lay person like myself, was he born that way? Like, how does someone, like, I can't imagine, like, I hate even squashing a bug, and
Yep.
and I've hunted before and stuff, but I hate even like just killing things by mistake is like heart wrenching for me. I can't imagine finding pleasure in murdering another human. And yet people like Ted Bundy and others actually found enjoyment in this. So are they born this way? Is it just something that come out of the womb and they're automatically evil?
So that is the big question, because the big question is, are they born evil, or do we create monsters? And probably the easiest view to digest is that they're born evil. So let's start there and then work our way down, because it's really easy to think that someone who is what we call a monster is born that way. But then when we see them caught, we say, well, they don't look like a monster. And I say, well, what's a monster supposed to look like? So let's dive into whether they are born that way. And to be honest, every single one of us has a propensity for evil. It's inside of our DNA. Every human civilization is born from violence. And if we want to look at the origins of violence, where do we go? We look at chimps. So if we look at the lethal aggression in chimp groups, wild chimps, and indigenous groups in Australia, it's great to look at indigenous groups because they're not industrialized like we are. We see very similar rates of death resulting from violence between group members. And it's always been this way. It wasn't that long ago since we were burning women because we thought that they were witches. We were burning people because we thought they were vampires because they had TB. Cannibalism is littered through the fossil records. We can see it in the fossil records of chimps. We see it in chimps. We see it in the fossil records of early humans. We can see it in bone fragments and evidence of consumption. So we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that within humanity, we have been defined by violence, and cruelty still lingers in our lineage. It lingers within our DNA. Every human civilization has wars mostly driven by things like group behaviors and religion, but it's there. Every human group has it. But the difference is, and what separates us from chimps, is that human beings also have a beautiful propensity for empathy. And in most of us, that overrules the violence. It overrules that animal nature. So the question is, in those of us that are evil, is that animal nature too strong? Have they not evolved that propensity for empathy that we have? And we can look in their genes to find some evidence of this, of a biological factor. Because if it's biological, it means that they're born that way because they can't control that. If it's a psychological thing, then it can be created. So if we look at something called karyotypes, and a karyotype is basically a picture of every person's chromosome. So every person has 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. And our genetic sex is given by the Y chromosome. So females have 46XX and males have 46XY. In criminals and potentially in psychopaths, there may be a difference in the quality and the qualitative and quantitative aspect of the chromosomes. So there's a syndrome called Klinefelter syndrome, which is XXY. They have one extra X chromosome. And you see this, it's 5 to 10 times more likely in criminals than it is in the general population.
So then I guess if that's true, I mean, but does every serial killer have that?
Nope. And that's the question, isn't it? Because we see something and we say, oh, well, if it's more likely in criminals, then that must be what's driving it. And there was a huge thing that went around about a criminal gene. And everyone said, if they have this gene, they are a criminal. And that's just not true. And what we found is that people with the XXY, the risk of convictions is actually related to the fact that because they have that, they are then subject to certain circumstances growing up. And it was the socioeconomic conditions related to that abnormality that was driving the criminal behavior.
But in, let me see, what was the year? You did a study. Let me just find the year here. It was printed in 2020. So the behavior sequence analysis of serial killers.
Yes.
Okay. So you were leading a study that kind of analyzed that. And at one point in the study, you were analyzing a lot of different childhood,
yes,
trauma that occurred in many serial killers, right? That you can kind of show, like many of them that had this type of abuse committed these type of crimes, and many that had this type of abuse committed these type of crimes. Then we look at someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who, at least according to what is written, he had a pretty normal childhood. Besides, his mom was depressed and his dad was kind of aloof and not really paying attention to the family. But overall, like, no one was beating him or sexually abusing him. And this guy was horrific, right? He was murdering people and eating them. So does that point to the fact that some people are just born with this, I don't want to say desire, but this switch that says this is what brings them happiness and pleasure? Because nothing in Dahmer's childhood even indicated that he tortured animals or anything like that. It's just all of a sudden he woke up one day and he's like, I'm going to kill this guy, and then start eating them.
I mean, what's interesting in what you said is that it brings him pleasure. So that would suggest a biological factor. And the reason I focused on pleasure is because there is some really interesting findings of this from the brain. So there's an assumption that people who are psychopaths, and obviously he was a psychopath, that they don't experience emotions. And that's not true. That's not necessarily true. It's not that they're emotionless. There are still emotions there. It's that they are emotionally blunted. They have reduced connectivity between parts of the brain responsible for social and effective decision making. So the ventromedial and anterior cingulate cortex in the prefrontal cortex. And basically what this means is that they have a poor neural connectivity between emotional centers that control emotional outbursts and violent feelings. So they can't stop themselves behaving on those aspects. But the most interesting part is that the more the aggressiveness increases, the more their blood pressure drops, meaning that the violence has a calming effect on them. So because of this brain malfunction in the amygdala and the emotional centers, that violence is bringing them calmness. It's actually creating not necessarily pleasure, that's slightly different, but it is creating this biological soothing effect.
I mean, Joe Navarro mentioned things like this in his book, Dangerous Personalities, right? Where, maybe not so much of the science, like you just talked about, a lot of the brain chemistry, but in his time and having to deal with psychopaths when he worked with the FBI, that there was a calming when they felt in control, even when they were talking about maybe the worst things on the planet. But they seemed very calm and in control as long as that destruction was in place. Which to me also, again, like whenever there's destruction around me, I am not calm. There is not any calmness going on. There's like
it's in most of us, our default response to anything like change is stress. It is stress and anxiety. That is our default response. In psychopaths, they're very calm. They don't really get that anxiety feeling, which is why, anxiety, we don't like anxiety disorder, but anxiety is a blessing because it reminds us that we care about what other people think. If you are totally void of anxiety, that's concerning because it means you don't care about other people's perception of your feelings, and that isn't healthy. That isn't psychologically healthy.
That's an interesting thought. When you said that, I was thinking about a research study I read where the military was trying to produce a drug that would disable a soldier's amygdala. And they were doing this test because they figured, well, if we could take this guy and remove his amygdala, then he can charge into battle without worrying about dying. He'd be a super soldier. But what they found in these tests is that by stopping the amygdala from working, it actually created almost like not just a fearless soldier, but a monster. There was no fear of killing people. There was no fear of hurting others. There was no fear of hurting people that were supposed to be on his side. There was like no fear, the fear that they wanted to take away of just running into a firing squad. They took away all fear, and it made this person almost like an empathetic or a non-empathetic killer. And that's interesting. When you said that, it's, those emotions that we have, even the ones that we may not like so much, are really good for a lot of reasons.
They stem from the same place. That's why psychopaths aren't always really angry and always really calm, because it's emotional bluntness. You can't say, I want to pick and choose the emotions that I have, because it doesn't work that way. We have to embrace the fact that we are emotional. But what I like about what you just said is that it's really relevant to some of the research including my own, on psychopathy or psychopathy even. And it's in terms of biological mediators. So head injury, where it damages the emotional sides of the brain, that's found in upwards of 10% of serial killers. So it basically creates lesion disorganization. And this is where organic lesions in the brain are damaged because of things like head damage or brain damage, and the emotional centers get damaged. And it creates this lack of emotion, and lack of emotion is very, very dangerous. And in the study that I did that you were talking about before, one of the studies I did was looking at cannibalistic serial killers. So we looked at serial killers that were non-cannibals and serial killers that were cannibals. And in both samples, we found child abuse. We also found head injuries. We also found alcohol abuse and substance abuse. And this is relevant as well.
Of the person? Like the person that was a serial killer, or the parents?
Yes. Oh, of the person.
Of the person doing substance and drug abuse. Okay.
Yeah. And alcohol deeply affects the brain. People say, drink in moderation. And it's like, well, alcohol breaks through the blood-brain barrier. So alcohol will always damage your brain. There's no such thing as moderate drinking. It's just causing less damage than you could be causing by drinking
come
more.
on, don't tell me that now. I like
the
idea of moderate drinking. You're really, come on, why do you got to be this way? I know.
But in just cannibalistic serial killers, rather than in both, so it might bring them away from just killing victims, but going that one gruesome step further, we found brain abnormalities. And that is a really key difference, because we found head injuries in both, but being born with a brain abnormality was more likely in cannibals, which does indicate a biological driver.
That should make logical sense. Like, if you get to the point where you're not just okay with murdering someone, but then you begin to eat them, it's like so not normal that you would have to imagine that to get to that part, like there's even things like, and I know like culturally this could be different depending on where you're from, but even when you're trying a new food for the first time, let's just say something that other people actually normally eat, like maybe the first time you go to Japan and you have something that may be so different looking from a Western piece of food, it's something raw, maybe even. And it just kind of has that natural, like almost like a gag reflex. Like you're going to try it. You're going to do it. And then you're like, oh, that wasn't bad. Right. So
Yeah.
But human.
But we have evolved that gag reflex because we've evolved to avoid anything that could be dangerous and poisonous. That's why we have that disgust response. Anything that is potentially unsafe has this instant disgust response. We see it in our nonverbals. It's because if something could cause us harm or make us sick, pathogens, we want them away from us.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But, I would elicit a disgust response in the face of human flesh. You would assume that if somebody doesn't, there's got to be something biologically incorrect there.
Yeah, I would assume that.
Yeah, but this raises an interesting question because there's a moral issue. If it's a biological effect, it means they're not in control. If our brain says do something, what control do we have to say to our brain, no, change the way you're wired? Does that take away the blame?
Is that true though? Like, okay, so like I could be driving down the road and someone cuts me off and my brain says, I would love to punch that guy in the face. But then critical thinking says, well, Chris, that's not only illegal.
Exactly.
But it's violent and I should not punch a guy in the face just for cutting me off. Yep. So I don't go punch him in the face.
Exactly, because your prefrontal cortex has said, don't do it. If there is no activation in the prefrontal cortex or blunted activation, that part of our brain that says, no, don't do it, isn't possible to be activated. The signal isn't sending. So whereas we can say, I wouldn't do that because it's not right, for them, they don't have the ability to make that thought.
And then is that because of the head injury or the drug abuse or the abuse as a child or something to that effect?
So interesting point. That's the question. There's no such thing as a criminal gene. When we talked earlier about the genes, that's an interesting finding, but it was still affected by socioeconomic status, which led to criminality. There is no such thing as a criminal gene. That has been highly refuted.
Right.
Just because there's correlation doesn't mean causation. And it's very dangerous to make that assumption as well. So on that note, is it more than biology? Biology is clearly a risk factor because if there is a biological effect, like we can see in psychopaths, if they have reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, you cannot train that activity back. You can't say, hey, work. If there is no activity there, it's going to be very, very difficult to change that because it's hardwired. But the fact that we see so much abuse and maladaptive influences in their history suggests that there could be an environmental influence. And the thing about the brain is, and this is what sets us apart from primates. So when we look at the violence in chimps and we look at pre-humans, the difference between chimp brains and our brains is that our brain structures, they change during development. So our brain morphology is very adaptive to the environment. We are very affected by what we go through, which is why the early years in life is so important because the brain is forming itself. You know, our prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed until 25. So think about all that time where we're teaching our brain connections, we're teaching it habits, we're teaching it to wire, neurons that fire together, wire together. What we're exposed to will show how we're going to act in the future. So those negative patterns in our past kind of prime us for the future. So it would make a lot of sense if early childhood abuse and early childhood influences have a big effect. And it's, working on cases like this of serial killers, sociopaths, and psychopaths, when you look at their histories, it humanizes them because you can see childhood abuse and traumatic experiences and usually parental abuse. And these things shape us significantly through our childhood. And there is a huge connection between early childhood abuse and criminal conduct. Obviously, not all people that experience abuse later become criminals. But when you look at serial killers' histories, more often than not, it's littered with these horrible experiences. And you can't help but look at those things and think, of course, that person ended up badly. Imagine going through all of that, what it does to the brain, what it does to the way you think about other people, the way you think about yourself, your social learning. Imagine going through all of that and then trying to come out as a healthy, well-functioning person. It's horrible because it does humanize them. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a woman who had some serious childhood trauma. As a young person, her parents moved around
3 different Asian countries. She was almost trafficked multiple times, in family abuse. She ends up, marrying a guy who they're together for 2 years, married for a year and a half. Then she gets pregnant and he punches her so hard in the face that he like literally lifts her off the ground, sends her flying. He beat her multiple times and then eventually slit her throat. She survives, right? She runs away from him with a brand new baby, living on the street, eating out of garbage cans, ends up getting some help, goes back to school. Like her life, just one thing after another. Now, what she does is she spends her whole life advocating for crimes against children.
Yeah.
Like she did not turn into a serial killer. She did not eat her baby. She didn't murder anybody. She has a laugh that can make anybody smile. Like it's mind blowing to me because like if she did turn into some horrible person, you'd almost go, oh, I get it. Like your life sucked. Like you were treated bad by your parents. You were treated bad by your husband. You were treated bad by the system. Like you would almost be like, yeah, okay, I get it. You're angry. Now you're like out killing people. But she didn't. She's an amazing human being that turned into this advocate for the suffering.
Yeah.
And then, you take on the other side, like, I won't try to quote it in your study that we were talking about. I have a paragraph here. You said previous literature suggests that early physical abuse leads to later aggression and violence. Current results partially support this. Although those who were physically abused were more likely to demonstrate overkill of their victims, the most specifically violent methods of kill were practiced by those who had been sexually or psychologically abused in earlier life. Yeah. So she had all of that, and she didn't turn into this overkill, sex crime killer, right? She turned into an unbelievable human being, but then look at Ted Bundy.
Exactly.
Right? It's crazy to me. And I'm sure there's many people like you that are trying to find the answer, because I guess if we could find the answer, it would go a long way in maybe finding a cure or being able to at least, predetermine if someone's going to be this horrible person at childhood. But wow, it just seems like that's a scary proposition that you don't know, right? And you don't know.
You highlight a really good point. Some people, they go through all of these things and you think, well, of course, they ended up this way. But then other people go through those things and end up as kind and caring human beings. So not all tormented and abused kids become serial killers. Mm-hmm. And not all serial killers were abused as kids either. It just means there is a strong relationship. But because it's not 100% either way, it's not all the environment. It's not all the biology. It's both.
Yeah.
It's a connection of both. And the biological drivers, they prime us for the experiences. Now, and this takes us into an important point. And I think really the answer will always sit within epigenetics. And epigenetics is really the study of gene expression rather than just a genetic code. So it's the interaction between nature and nurture. How does our environment change the way that our genes are expressed? Because just because we have certain genes that will determine that we are more likely to act a certain way, our genes are not set in stone. It doesn't mean, our genes are set in stone, but that doesn't mean our behavior is set in stone, because they can be turned on and off. Our environment affects the way the genes are expressed. So when you have one and not the other, you might not get that outcome behavior. When you have both, you are so much more likely to have that outcome behavior. Just because a child susceptible to genetically determined violence doesn't mean that they are going to be violent. It just means they are genetically more likely to, nor the other way around.
Does personal emotional makeup also affect someone's ability to, I think about and not talking about serial killing or anything horrific, but I grew up with one brother and two sisters. we're all different.
Yep.
Communicate differently. We handle stress differently. We handle family stress differently. And when I say differently, I'm not saying like, oh, they're terrible and I'm awesome. It's not that. I'm saying like we all handle it differently.
Yeah.
Yet we all had the same two parents. Right.
Yep.
So I look at that and I'm like, any one of us could have turned into a serial killer, I guess. But, it's like, fortunately, not that I know, none of us are. But it's like, you look, I hope not. I mean, I'm not, but I don't know about the rest of them, But, I look at that and I say, like, that is, and we are really so different in the way that we deal with just every day. Like, we can have the same decision sitting in front of us, and each one of us will make a completely different choice on how to handle it. Exactly. And I have to imagine that, like what you just said with abuse and these things, I think about that person who I spoke to yesterday. When she spoke about her mother, she also said some really fond, wonderful things, and she would smile. She would smile in her face about talking about her mom. And at the end, when we were done, I actually talked to her about that because I'm like, it's just so weird to see you talk about like your childhood being so rough and terrible. But then when you spoke about your mom, it was these warm feelings. And so for her, even though she had all these horrific things, there was also these memories that were not terrible. These memories that were warm.
So that plays a lot from personality, because we've got our genetics, we've got our predetermined influences and risk factors, and we've got our environment. But each one of us, we have our own personalities. We have our own way of coping with things. We have our own thought patterns. And all of these things feed into who we are. And our personalities can change and fluctuate across our lives. But those things affect how the environment will affect us, as well as the biology. So we are very, very complicated and interconnected. And to say there is one thing that creates a monster, are we natural born killers or do we create monsters? Well, it's both. It's a bit of both. It's impossible to say that this one thing creates a serial killer. And on that, I did a study with a research partner on there's the wetting the bed, setting fires, and killing animals. And these were the trio of behaviors that were originally supposed to be signals that that person is going to be a serial killer. And it's from a misunderstanding of an FBI study that was carried out many, many years ago that found that those three behaviors were more common in serial killers than in non-serial killers. And people said, oh, well, if I see these three characteristics in a person, they're going to be a serial killer. It's not true. And actually, it's very rare that those three things turn up. The reason that we couldn't publish the data is because we couldn't get enough data. We got loads.
I'm glad that's not true, because half of my childhood friends would be serial killers then.
Yeah. Set fires and killed animals as well.
I mean, when I was young, I had kids at school that would like put firecrackers and frogs and stuff. I hated it. I could never do it, but they would do these things and laugh. And
I love frogs.
And it used to bother me all the time. But I'm thinking when you just said that, and like, I think all of us wet the bed at some point, so I'm thinking like, holy mackerel, like if that's the case, then like 90% of my childhood friends are probably serial killers right now.
Luckily it's not the case, but
That's good.
I feel my heart hurts for those frogs.
Yeah, me too.
I love frogs. But so killing of animals and torturing animals is very indicative of future violence. If you see anybody getting enjoyment out of harming a creature, that is a sign to you that intervention needs to be played.
That makes sense.
That is a signal that there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
Animals are a fantastic thing to introduce into a family because they teach us empathy. They teach us about death. They teach us love. And we have a very similar neurochemical reaction to loving an animal as we do loving a human. That's why they're very good for therapy and coping with trauma. And anybody that is capable of getting pleasure from harming an animal, it's not a big leap to harming a person neurologically. So it's a very, very dangerous signal. But as we said, there's not one single indicator. And these three indicators really didn't mean anything. People are far too complicated to say there is this one pattern that creates a serial killer. And if we see this pattern, that person's going to be a serial killer. So much more complicated than that. But what these studies do tell us is there is a biological risk factor. And absolutely, childhood abuse is a risk factor. So is parental mistreatment. That is a big risk factor. So is isolation, because it pushes that emotional side of things and creates that excess stress, and removing yourself from being around people is teaching negative behaviors. And then we have things like personality and interactions, and all of these things combined, we can see risk factors, but they are simply risk factors. And it doesn't mean that the accumulation of them is always going to mean a serial killer, but we should stay vigilant for them, because if we see them, we then try and intervene.
Yeah, so that was going to be my question is, if I go to my primary doctor and he does some blood tests and he doesn't find anything terrible, doesn't find any cancer, he doesn't find diabetes or whatever, but he says, hey, you have some indicators. Some of this blood work shows me that, maybe your thyroid or your pancreas isn't working right. That could lead to diabetes. So I want you to start doing X, Y, and Z, preventative, right? So yeah. I don't have diabetes. He's not going to start giving me insulin, but he's saying if you do these things, you can avoid it, right?
Yeah.
So if we see a child that maybe was taken now from his home because his parents were abusive, he shows some of these indicators that you say, what can be done to, and I know we can't ensure it, but to try, let's use the word try to ensure, what can be done to try to ensure that that child does not later on become a serial killer?
I mean, if we take a child out and we can see, there are pre-indicators biologically of psychopathy. That's how we diagnose it. And if we see those indicators, absolutely, we can take them out and try and support them. Now, psychopathy is very complicated. Psychopathy and sociopathy are very different but confused. Sociopathy is socialized. So you can create a sociopath through their experiences. Psychopath can't be created. You pretty much are born biologically a psychopath. Mm-hmm. And then those environmental influences create that negative behaviors. If we see those indicators early on, we can take them out and try and socialize them correctly and try and put them in safe environments. But this is the difficulty, because the international systems aren't conducive of support.
Yeah.
Because it would be amazing if there was more focus on supporting victims of child abuse. And it's like the amazing work that you guys do with ILF, trying to remove these predators from people's lives and try and support children. But there just isn't enough resources focused on it. And it's
100%
it's
true.
A sad truth. And, it would be amazing to see more intervention focused in there. And there's definitely some fantastic charities and nonprofits and governmental work focused in that direction, but it's a huge mission. And because it is so complicated, there is only so much we can do. But we do know the risk factors, and science every day is working in the right direction to discover what creates evil and what creates a serial killer. That we are making some fantastic findings, and studies like the work that I did on cannibalism, just recognizing those biological indicators is great, because it means we can flag them. If we see these indicators, it means this person might potentially be a threat. Now we need to do something. Now we need to intervene before there's a threat there. So it's always worth digging into this research, and maybe one day we'll find an indicator. I doubt we will. But the more we know, the more we can support and help.
It's a hard battle, because, in dealing with crimes against children, you stop a predator, which more often than not is someone related, family, friend.
Yeah.
And the child then gets taken and put into, what we call here CPS, Child Protection Services. And a large majority of those people are also abusers, or in it just for the money. So there's no real love. So the child was taken away from someone who was directly hurting them or sexualizing them. But then they're put into a situation that is, not much better. Maybe they're not being directly hurt anymore, but there's no love, there's no healing. They're just now not being punched every day or not being hurt every day. So yeah, it's a hard one because, we might be able to see the indicators, but it's like, even if you did an amazing study tomorrow and you said, here are 5 indicators that this person is definitely a pedophile, or this person is definitely, even if you could do that, I know you can't, but let's say you could, there's no way on earth you're going to be able to assign the FBI or Department of Homeland Security or SAS or whatever it is around the globe to go arresting people that have not committed a crime that have these indicators. Right? It's just not going to happen. Yeah. We're not living in Minority Report, so.
Yeah. And even if we could, we shouldn't. Because just because somebody could do something doesn't mean they want to, and it doesn't mean they will.
Right.
Even if a person has the ability to and has the genetic influences to do that, if they don't want to harm, then they shouldn't be put in prison because they are still a human being. They still have rights. We need to take those populations and we need to do something with them. We don't need to put them in prison. We don't need to punish them for crimes they haven't committed because they're still human beings. We need to stop those crimes being committed. We also need to create safety. We need to stop people that could potentially commit crimes and intervene and give them a way to stop committing those crimes. But that's a huge battle. And we need to provide safety for children, particularly, and this is something I feel very strongly about, in the foster care system. Because the foster care system is a very dangerous place to be. And it's heartbreaking when children are taken from these maladaptive circumstances and put in a system that doesn't support them. The answer to these things is love and empathy and care and social support. And touch, if you deprive a child of touch, and there was a really interesting study done on this, you feed a child and you provide them everything they need to survive, but you deprive them of love, you deprive them of touch, they don't grow into a healthy human being. They don't biologically grow in the way that they should. It also stunts their growth. And that speaks volumes to the fact that we need to connect with other people. We need to feel safe with other people. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily the answer because the answer is very complicated, but it's absolutely a step in the right direction. I think this brings us to a really fitting end with a quote
before you end, I wanted to tell you, I was reading an article on that point of what you just said. And there was this orphanage in China that routinely, like, the babies wouldn't get adopted, they would malnourish, and they would be given food, get their diaper changed every day, but these children would die. They would never make it past a year and a half. Then there was this, all out of the blue, all of a sudden, there's this group of like 5 or 6 kids that started to flourish. They were healthy, they were growing, they weren't losing weight. So nobody can figure it out. The people who ran the orphanage couldn't figure it out. So they set up a camera one day to figure out what is happening with these kids that is different. And what they found was a cleaning lady that would come in at night, and in between cleaning things, she would pick up one of the babies and just hold it for a couple minutes and put it back, and then she'd clean more. And because of her schedule, she could only get to 5 or 6 kids. But it was those same 5 or 6 kids. Every night she would come in, those 5 or 6 kids would get picked up and rocked a little and kissed on the forehead and then put back. And those 5 or 6 kids didn't die. And it was like just something as simple as a cleaning lady coming in at night for a couple minutes per child, just touching them and holding them. And all of the rest, they all had the same food, same diaper change, same medicines, water. Like, they had all the things they needed, but those 5 or 6 infants got held. And they survived. And like, I read that and I'm like, that's amazing. That, I mean, I know it's not a scientific study, but it was amazing to read that everything was the same except for one thing, and those 5 got held.
Yeah, I mean, we need love and we need touch. We need social connections. It's like the famous Harvard study that was looking at reducing mortality. So how do we live longer? How do we live longer and healthier lives? And obviously they looked at things like diet and exercise and all of those things. And obviously our diet is very conducive of a healthy life. Exercise, very conducive. But the overall factor, the driving factor, was our social connections. when we don't have strong social connections, when we are isolated, it creates increased risk of mortality. We are a social species. We are wired to be social. And we're going to get to that point in a couple of episodes where we talk about cooperation and information elicitation. But we are absolutely a social species. There is no doubt about that. Every part of us, it's in our DNA to be social. We need love. And is it a cure to evil? Who knows? But it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I cut you off when you said in the end you had something fun. So what's the fun out of this horrible topic? What could possibly be fun? Oh, okay.
I said an interesting quote.
Oh, interesting. I'm sorry.
Quote, then I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I thought you said fun, but I couldn't just be here. I wanted to maybe hear fun. I don't know.
I hope I didn't say fun. If I did, it's not fun. It's just interesting. It's a good quote from the FBI, Jim Clementine, when talking about serial killers. He said that genetics load the gun, the personality and psychology aim the gun, and our experiences pull the trigger. And I think that is a great quote to emphasize the interconnected nature of all of these influences. You know, we neither create a killer nor are they born a killer. It's everything. It's both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that wasn't a fun quote, but it was interesting. Thank you for, as always, bringing in a ton of research, which for everyone listening, all the research notes will be in our show notes. So if you have access to our research library, you can read the things that this podcast were based on. In addition to Abbie's own research, both of those will be listed in there. So you can check all of that out. And you can join us next month on the Doctor Is In series, where we'll be discussing shame. The good, the bad, and the coping. I'm really excited about this topic because shame, for anyone who's listened to this podcast at all, we've talked about it before as one of those things that's really hard to understand and something that we would never use as professional social engineers. So this will be a really fascinating topic to understand it more from a scientific level with our resident doctor. So
shame was actually brought in. Somebody requested it. So if you have any other requests for topics, please message us and request a topic, because we will put them in future episodes. And it's great to see what people are enjoying listening to. Oh,
I'm glad that's a good suggestion from whoever did it. So thank you for suggesting it. And keep those comments coming in. It really helps us. Thanks, Abbie, for another great episode.
Thank you, Chris, for another great episode.
And thanks everyone for listening. Until next month, we'll see you.